This story begins in Orr. The Orians were a magically advanced people, okay? A nation built on the leaking energies of a sleeping Zaitan below them. Orr was the land, as well, where the gods lived, and during their brief stay on Tyria, they gathered many relics and remnants of the previous Elder Dragon Rising, in an attempt to either study or hide their existence from the races of the world. It should be no surprise then that the Orian people had a great many artifacts at their disposal. These artifacts would be hoarded and gifted to the other nations of the world. Two such artifacts are the twin swords Magdea and Sohothin. Both swords are shaped as dragon heads, breathing fire as blades. Their exact origin is unknown. Were they forged by the master wizards and magicians of Old Orr, or perhaps were they just looted from the gods' vaults beneath Arra? We don't know the answer to that question, but I will come back to this idea. As the three human nations of Tyria grew in power, wars broke out, okay? The Guild Wars, what this franchise is named after. What you might not know is that until the third and final Guild War, Orr had always managed to stay out of the conflicts. It viewed its own nation as a peaceful and holy land, and it sought to keep blood out of its streets at all costs. This ultimately would fail when the Char stormed their borders after the searing of Ascalon, but hey. And how did Orr achieve this? How did they manage to stay so hands-off with the many wars between Critons and Ascalonians? Well, at one point at least, it was by bargaining off two of their powerful artifacts, Magdea and Sohothin, both given to Ascalon in exchange for continued peace. From here, the swords stayed with Ascalonian royalty through the generations. They seem to have become something of a symbol as Ascalon's strength, with many replica swords being made and distributed amongst their armies. That fiery dragon sword that you see in the Hall of Monuments, for instance, and the many that we saw in Guild Wars 1, yeah, those are replicas of the two real artifacts from Orr, from ancient Orr, Sohothin and Magdea. The swords stayed there until, at last, the Char brought down the searing on Ascalon and went on to invade all human nations. This was at the peak of the Third Guild War, and the Char broke the Ascalonian defences. 20 long years of gradual defeat later, and the Char were on the brink of victory. But King Adalbern, the last king of Ascalon, still had one thing: the sword Magdea. Adalbern used it to cast the Foe Fire. He sacrificed the lives of his remaining countrymen in exchange for a massive explosion that killed all Char in the area. But it didn't end there. The dead Ascalonians, those recently killed and even those from the initial searing 20 years ago, rose from the dead as ghosts. And there they've stayed, preventing the Char from ever truly conquering Ascalon ever since. Now, legend goes that should the two swords, Magdea and Sohothin, be reunited in the hands of a true heir to the Ascalon throne, then the ghosts will cease to exist. They will be brought to rest. Not many in the world necessarily believe that anymore, but the question does come up, where are the swords? So at launch of Guild Wars 2, Magdea was still with King Adalbern's ghostly body in the catacombs of Ascalon. And Sohothin, it's with Rytlock Brimstone. How the hell did that happen? Alright, so let me take you back. When the Char brought down the searing on Ascalon, Adalbern, the king, had Magdea, while Rurik, his son, and the prince of the nation, had Sohothin. Rurik and Adalbern had a shaky relationship, though, which resulted in the prince's exilement from the country in the year 1072 AE. Rurik took his sword away from Ascalon across the Shiver Peaks in an attempt to find a new home in Krita, but Rurik never quite made it. He was killed at the Frostgate by the Stone Summit. But he wasn't just killed, his body was trapped under an avalanche, and so his people just left him buried on the mountains before they as well froze to death. So the sword was lost under the snow, and the sword was therefore lost to Ascalon. It would, in a way, be returned to the men of Orr. The nation had been destroyed at this point, but their last vizier, now an undead lich, dug out Rurik's lone body on the mountainside and reanimated him. Undead Rurik, sword in hand, was then taken to the Fire Island chain. This is a hellish island chain in southwestern Tyria you won't have seen if you've only played Guild Wars 2. It's there on the map, but it's not accessible terrain. You see, the Vizier was planning to use Rurik as a sort of final gambit to protect himself during his plans in the events of Guild Wars 1, but ultimately that gambit failed, and the volcanic island that Rurik was on erupted. It swallowed the Lich, it swallowed the Prince, and it swallowed the fiery dragon sword Sohothin with it. Also, as a side note, which I've always found immensely interesting, Sohothin wasn't the only Orrian artifact on the Fire Island chain at that point. The Vizier also owned the Scepter of Orr, but the Scepter of Orr mysteriously vanished before the lava could destroy it, and we don't know why. Well, you can speculate a lot, but that may have to be a mystery for another day. Sohothin wasn't so lucky. It didn't randomly disappear, it was just swallowed by the Fire Island chain. What happened next? Well, 250 years pass, and Rytlock has the sword. That's right, there's no explanation for it. And really, that's our first mystery for this video. How the heck did that happen? First of all, when you want to look into how Rytlock might have got this, you have to consider that very few mortals could even find a port at the Fire Island chain. This is a really deadly, dangerous area that is very difficult to even port at, let alone survive on or traverse its wastes. It was the only reason we managed to do it in Guild Wars 1 is because we had the help of the dwarves, who are now extinct, and even they had the help of a portal that was in the Shiver Peaks built by the Massart that allowed them to teleport there with relative ease. So the Massart, incidentally, are actually the only people we know of in this universe to have had a persisting presence on those lands. The Massarts were ancient and powerful enough and great enough spellcasters that they were able to survive there. They'd built massive fortifications and defense networks, all in the name of preventing their own destruction. So who else had gone there? Had maybe a surviving Massart come across the sword and recovered it? A curious dwarf after they were turned to stone, perhaps? Or was it really a mortal? Had a mortal, someone much more vulnerable to the dangers of the Fire Island chain, arrived? If they had, then they would certainly need a lot of motivation for going to that region of the world. Does that mean that they specifically went to recover the sword? And at what point, therefore, did the sword we're now talking about pass from that person's hands to Rytlock's? None of this we know. What about Rytlock himself? Is that a possibility? Rytlock's a big character in this franchise, but here's the second mystery, okay? What do we actually know about him? Well, first of all, we know he's a bit of an oddball. He's not a conventional Char in any way. He was communicating and working with humans before the war was even over. That alone is a big red flag. Okay, he's recently seen a lot of success in the Black Citadel, becoming a tribune of the Blood Legion, but what about before all of that? The earliest we meet this character is in the Blaze Ridge Steppes during the events of Edge of Destiny, the second novel, and at this point, he already has Sohothin. Further, when he and Logan have that fateful meetup there on the Blaze Ridge Steppes, when these two characters first meet one another, Logan instantly recognizes the sword and berates Rytlock for it. He says, "How dare you have that sword? Is your name Rurik Brimstone?" So that's fine and makes sense, except that there were loads of replicas of this sword, right? So could Logan just instantly distinguish that Rytlock, this random Char, wasn't wielding a replica sword, he was wielding the real thing? Or, on the other hand, did Rytlock already have some renown as a Char that wielded the mighty Sohothin? It gets even weirder when you realise Rytlock isn't even with his warband. Rytlock is a Blood Legion Char. He has a Blood Legion warband, the Stone Warband. But in this early event when we first meet him, he's working with Iron Legion. They talk about how Rytlock has deliberately distanced himself from his own warband, his family. People that in the events of the book, if you read it, it sounds like he still cares greatly for. So why did he do that? This would be much easier to answer if we had a chance to meet any member of the Stone Warband throughout this entire game series, but we can't. There's not a single member of the Stone Warband in-game until very recently, where with Living Story, we've had the addition of Rox, who has just joined the warband herself. But when Logan later asks Rytlock, during the events of the novel, how did you end up with Iron Legion instead of your own family, the Blood Legion? Rytlock simply replies with, "My reasons are my own." And we get no more. It's a really interesting perspective on this character. Who the hell even is Rytlock? You think you know him, but there's a lot of weird stuff about his past that ArenaNet have set up, but never told us about. So anyway, let's go back to the story of the Faux Fire. At the launch of Guild Wars 2, we have Adalburn with Magdea, and the oddball Rytlock Brimstone, ex-member of Destiny's Edge and current Blood Legion Tribune, with Sohothin. When Kaith and Air, during the events of the personal story, attempt to reunite the group at around level 30 or so, Rytlock and Logan get into an argument. Logan says to Rytlock, "If you have something to say it to my face," to which Rytlock responds, "I would if you weren't always running away. I should gut you and be done with it." To which Logan says, "Gut me with what? That human-made sword you looted from Ascalon? I've had enough, we're done here." So Logan immediately thinks that Rytlock looted it from Ascalon and it has nothing to do with the Fire Island chain, which is interesting enough. But afterwards, Air steps in and says, "It's sad to see Logan and Rytlock argue. If only there was something to bond them together. Yes, I know what might help. I fear this meeting was a mistake, but maybe I can fix it." You guys might remember that scene. It's where everybody meets up in Lion's Arch. If you've ever wondered what Air's plan was there, that's Ascalon Catacombs. Her plan is to recover Magdea from the undead king's hands herself to give to Logan and perhaps appease his resentment. This is the Ascalon Catacombs dungeon. Rytlock then gets word of Air's meddling around, and Rytlock then travels through the dungeon with the player character to try and stop her. Air's plan sort of halfway succeeds. She doesn't help this with the situation with Destiny's Edge, and she doesn't manage to get people back together, but she does recover Adalbern's sword. The dungeon tells us that it's broken. It was shattered by the king when he brought down the Faux Fire 230 years ago. But apparently, according to Air, this isn't a problem. She claims that she knows a blacksmith who can repair it. And then... nothing. Again, like the dungeon ends and we get nothing more. Air tells us that she can repair this great artifact that could mean this big thing for the lands of Ascalon. And then they don't give us a single thing. Rytlock leaves with Sohothin, and the status of Magdea is now up in the air. It's in the hands of, presumably, some Norn blacksmith, but otherwise completely MIA. It doesn't return at any point for the storyline of Guild Wars 2. Even if both swords were returned to the ruins of Ascalon City, they'd need to be in the hands of an heir of King Doric, and those are few and far between now. There's only one surviving human nation left with a king or queen. That would be Kryta and Queen Jenna. Interestingly enough, though, there is another character who could pull off the same thing. That would be the Duke of Ebonhawk, Commander Samuelson. The game states he too is descended from the kings of old, from King Doric. So we have two characters that could potentially bring the swords together. But do they have any motivation for doing it? Even if they could get the one sword off of Rytlock and the other sword off of the Norn? One final note as well, perhaps, on the origin of these blades that I mentioned at the start of the video. It's perhaps no coincidence, okay, that the Orions, who are a nation of people that were drawing magic from the Elder Dragon of Death sleeping below them, had so many artifacts that impacted the undead in some way. Look at the track record of relics that we've had from Orr, okay? The Scepter of Orr, the Dark Scrolls that were read by Vizier Kilbron that turned him into a lich, and now we have two swords, twin swords, that reanimated the remains of an entire nation's casualties of war. So does that mean that the Ascalonian dead, are they roundabout minions of Zhaitan in some bizarre way? It certainly has an interesting perspective on them. And what does that mean, if true, now that Zhaitan's dead? Should their power wane somehow over time? That would be a lot easier to answer if we even knew whether the Risen were weakening. But last we saw, Tequattle's been getting stronger as a part of the living story. So who knows what we can expect there. Maybe the weapons aren't related to Zhaitan at all. The blades are made of fire, after all. And Edge of Destiny specifically mentions that destroyers grow in strength and feed from the swords. So does that mean that they somehow relate to Primordus? These weren't artifacts created by the Orions or the gods based off of Zhaitan's power, but they were artifacts from eons ago before the gods ever existed and the old races were fighting against the Elder Dragons, and the gods had gathered them up, hidden them underneath Arra, and eventually the Orion people found them and gifted them to the Ascalonians. If they do therefore relate to Primordus, maybe he's somehow responsible for their recovery on the Molten Fire Island chain. These are questions that we cannot answer, guys. That's why this is a Guild Wars 2 Mysteries, but maybe one day Rytlock will break down and really tell us what happened to him. Because I think he's the real star of the show. We're talking about deep history, the years before the gods came to Tyria, the nature of the Orions and their artifacts, the Guild Wars, the struggle between the Ascalonians and the Char, and it all winds down to this mysterious past behind this big character in Guild Wars 2. Rytlock is a Blood Legion tribune, he's an ex-member of Destiny's Edge, but it turns out he could be worth a lot lot more to the plot of this game that goes far beyond and exceeds that of his friends in Destiny's Edge. Let me know what you think, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next Guild Wars 2 Mysteries.